Hello, everybody. A couple of days ago, we did an interesting show with Isaac Stanley Becker, who reports for the Washington Post. He has a new book out, Europe Without Borders, a History. It's a history of the Schengen Agreement, which allows anyone within the EU to travel from country to country without showing their passport. But one of the unintended consequences, I guess, of Schengen is it's turned Europe into a kind of fortress. And in my conversation with Stanley Becker, we agreed that 2005 would be a year in which borders would become increasingly problematic and central in political analysis, given the new Trump administration, given the border struggle in the Ukraine war, and given the increasing challenge of immigration to states in the West. Our guest today, Laurie Trautman, who is the co-author of When the World Closed Its Doors, the COVID-19 Tragedy and the Future of Borders, might be a sneak preview, if not of 2025, but of the future. Laurie is an expert on borders and immigration, and she is joining us from Bellingham, Washington. Laurie, congratulations on the new book. I'm not sure if you had the chance to see Stanley Becker's book on Schengen, but does it ring a bell for you? Are all the world's borders? I want to get into the narrative of your book and the impact of COVID on borders, but is everywhere, particularly in the West, becoming more and more of a fortress these days?
It certainly feels that way, whether it's politics shifting in one direction that favors hardened borders or more conflicts and unrest. It seems like borders are more and more the focus of solutions and challenges as we move through various parts of the world.
You sound rather resigned, Laurie. You're talking to us from the United States. Are you particularly concerned with the incoming Trump administration? I was going to say regime, but perhaps it'd be fairer to call it an administration. And its attitude to borders. Donald Trump, in his first presidency, threatened or promised to build a wall. He never did. This time, he's promising to throw out people in this country who are here, at least in his mind, illegally.
Yeah, I mean, look, regardless of what he actually is able to do and is able to put into place based on what his rhetoric is, the rhetoric itself is harmful. The rhetoric itself will drive people to make choices and decisions that will upend their lives and could put them in dangerous positions. So, yeah, I am concerned. I don't think there's a lot of optimism that a Trump administration will re-engage in the world of multilateralism. That's not his thing. It certainly wasn't his thing during the first administration. And I doubt that we will get back to stronger multilateral agreements and cooperative mechanisms during the next 4 years.
Some people might say, Laurie, if they were watching, if they're Trump supporters, that the majority of Americans are sympathetic to Trump, that his position on immigration, even if it was sometimes rather vulgar and even immoral, was popular. And even the Democrats are very ambivalent. And one of the biggest vote getters in the Harris-Trump campaign was Trump on immigration versus Kamala Harris. How would you respond to that? That yes, the world's borders are shutting, whether it's the United States or the European Union, but most people simply don't want immigrants.
Sure. I mean, I wouldn't disagree that we have challenges at our borders around the world. I don't think the U.S. southern border with Mexico is a good example of how borders should be managed. There's problems with that scenario and those policy directions, but your borders are not the answer. That's a lot of what our book is really about. Is that borders have become kind of the big red button to protect us from what's outside, but very rarely are they actually able to accomplish those kinds of goals. And I think to take it to the next step, an over reliance on borders actually undermines the policy work that needs to be done, whether that's related to public health support in the situation of COVID or related to something like crime and drug smuggling. I mean, we can see many instances in the United States and around the world where borders have been hardened, and it does very little to actually address the problems that are trying to be addressed.
I want to get to the book, When the World Closed Its Doors, the COVID-19 Tragedy and the Future of Borders. But before we get there, what do you mean the problem isn't borders? You mean the problem isn't borders when it comes to what, legal or illegal immigration?
Well, legal immigration is a very different conversation, right? We're talking about visas and we're talking about processing mechanisms and quotas. We're not talking about, I think, what Trump is really focused on and what many populist governments are focused on, which is this idea that borders are out of control, that there is this undocumented immigration and this illegal flow that needs to be managed. But in reality, those flows are going to continue even if you put up barbed wire fences and you put up walls. People will find ways to get around them if that's their goal. And while you may be able to slow down the flow of, say, illicit drugs, for example, those drugs find other ways to get in, and there are other ways that are perhaps more difficult to uncover. So one example is during COVID, there was fewer trucks crossing the border between the U.S. and Mexico, and so many drug cartels shifted to a substance like fentanyl, which is easier to ship because it requires less cargo space. So those things that we're trying to solve, whether it's crime, whether it's irregular migration, whether it's public health threat, just using borders alone will not solve those problems, and will create other problems as well.
I know you're an expert in this area, and I'm curious whether you've looked at research suggesting public opinion. I remember maybe 10 years ago, there were many images of really heartrending images of immigrants or wannabe immigrants to Europe. There was the image of the dead child on the Greek beach. Many migrants from the Syrian civil war. Does that actually impact on public opinion? Are people who are often rather indifferent to the rights of immigrants, does their position soften when they see photos of dead children on Greek beaches or on the Mexican border?
Yes and no. In the example of the young boy who washed up on the shores of Europe, that actually had a huge impact on Europe's approach to handling migration. And it got the message across that these people aren't necessarily just the way they're cast as criminals and lawbreakers. There's innocent children who get caught up in that as well. Now, the opposite could be true as well, though. On the US-Mexico border, we see a lot of images, and I think the media tries to show the human side of some of these experiences. But if you're a hardline against asylum seekers, against refugees, against immigration, I don't think you're going to shift people's opinion based on images.
I'm guessing that you and your co-author, Edward Alden, are on the permissive or on the progressive side when it comes to immigration. Are there countries or politicians who you respect who offer a model for a more progressive attitude to immigration as opposed to simply open borders? And of course, in contrast to somebody like Trump in the US or Orban in Hungary or other populists whose political support and strength is built on a paranoia about imagined or actual immigrants?
Well, I would have said Canada recently, but Canada's changing their position as well. I mean, I'm not somebody who would ever advocate for open borders. I advocate for well-managed borders, and part of that is a really good, strong legal immigration system. Canada's system is a point system, so that if what you're looking for is immigrants with certain skills, then that's who you're letting in, rather than the US system, which has a family based system. And so we end up getting people who may not be employable or not have those skills. And I think that in and of itself feeds this fear about people that are going to come across the border and not be able to support themselves. So I think a very strong legal immigration system is a very good counterbalance to fears about undocumented immigration.
How do you feel individually, perhaps, or in policy terms, about regulations that reward people with university degrees or specific skills? There seems to be a debate or perhaps even a civil war now within the Republican Party, within the MAGA movement, between men like Elon Musk and some of the more nativist MAGA people about who the Republicans should let into the United States?
Well, I think it has to be both. And I have to look at labor market dynamics. So if we're looking for high skilled workers, then there should be ways to bring them in quickly and in a targeted fashion. And the United States really struggles with that. Our H-1B program is supposed to be doing that, but it's capped and it has backlogs and it's very cumbersome. At the same time, we need people to wash dishes and change sheets in hotel rooms. And those aren't going to be people that are coming in on a high skilled worker scenario. So I think it has to be a balance. There's always a bit of a tug of war between bringing people in to do jobs that, quote unquote, Americans will or won't do, and taking jobs away from American workers. So, how do you find that balance? I mean, it's really being in tune with the labor market and having an efficient system so that it can be dynamic. And the United States system is anything but dynamic and responsive. It's very slow to move.
Yeah, unions, or historically unions, labor unions have been ambivalent about immigration. I've heard arguments made that if America does indeed, or if the Trump administration does indeed do what it promises to do and throw out millions of illegal immigrants, then there won't be the labor to do the low wage jobs. But the counter argument on that, Laurie, and you know these arguments much better than I do, is that American citizens would be properly paid for their labor. And this gray area when it comes to immigration actually enables low wages.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with the low wage argument. And look, there's not much credit to the scenario that says that we should be allowing people to work without documentation while they're continuing to depress, wages. I don't think that's a good, strong argument. I think a stronger argument is, again, a legal system. So whether that is a guest worker program or something that enables workers or employers to get the workers that they need, but in a legal pathway, also would bring wages up, right? Because you're going to have legal, you know, pay stubs and social security and all of that. I mean, you're not going to have people being paid under the table if an employer is sponsoring a worker to come to the US, whether that's on a temporary status or a status that has some kind of pathway to legalization, which we currently don't really have in our low skilled stream.
What Trump is threatening to do, and please correct me if I'm wrong, has already been done by a post-war U.S. administration, the Eisenhower administration. Is that true? And if so, what happened? How did they manage to round up millions of people who were in this country without papers and send them back, whatever that means?
Well, deportation is nothing new, right? I mean, it's been consistently happening by pretty much every administration. The Obama administration also was a huge deporter of undocumented migrants. Sometimes those are workplace raids where you have places where it's pretty much known that there's a lot of undocumented workers. This has particularly happened in the South in meatpacking plants, for example, where you have a large number of workers in a fairly small space. This has unfortunately happened too in places near schools, where you don't want kids to be scared to go to school because they may get deported. So it's happened frequently over the years, and again, it's sort of what has that done? Okay, it sent people home. There's nothing to stop them from coming back. There's a cost associated with that, but I think what our migratory pathways have shown are that people that want to come to the US often find ways to get here. It may cost more money, may be more difficult, and that simply feeds into more criminal activity to help people get across the border.
Going to come to your book after this final question more broadly on US immigration. So people are going to be listening and thinking to themselves, well, this is all very well, and we can all have all sorts of arguments against Trump's immigration or hostility to immigration. But what's the answer? What's the answer to the however many millions of people are in this country without their correct papers, 5, 10, 15 million people, however many people, whoever you believe on this front. There are certainly millions of people in this country who are here without the correct papers. What solution would you give?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question because it's so politicized. So the last time we had major comprehensive immigration reform was 1986, and that included a legalization program. It included an overhaul to our various guest worker programs, et cetera, et cetera. And, what did that legalization program do? I mean, we could talk at length about whether or not that process was successful or not, and whether or not it encouraged people to immigrate illegally because there was a legalization option. I think the answer is not a simple one, and it's not one, right? There's many different sort of prongs to the issue that could be tweaked in different ways. Getting back to more legal pathways is a really important one. The Biden administration tried something new with the southern border around asylum applications before you ever reach the border using an app on people's phones. Took a while to get going. It had problems to begin with, but it actually provided a pathway that removed people from trying to cross between ports of entry. So I think it's a trial and error system, but our political system doesn't seem to be willing to try much at all because no one wants to face those errors and that political backlash. So it's not a simple answer, and it's going to require a lot of different levers: workplace enforcement, maybe legalization, maybe not, and pathways to citizenship for people that are here working legally.
Yeah, I'm getting the sense that maybe you are dodging the question because there really isn't an answer. I know as a legal immigrant to America, been here for many years, I filled out the correct forms. Why? And people like myself might think to themselves, why should people in any way be rewarded for coming here without filling those forms out? Why should there be a legal pathway for people who are in this country without the correct papers?
Because many of them are incorporated in our communities. Many of them are studying in our universities, and there are many of them, not all of them, right? It's very hard to talk about these things too broadly without getting some repercussions and some holes in the arguments. But many of them are actually part of our society. So we may be better off actually incorporating them fully rather than having situations where, for example, people can't have driver's licenses because they don't have paperwork, and then they're driving without insurance and without a driver's license. So I think that there is a middle ground. I do agree that people should be using the legal channels, but the legal channels aren't adequate for the demand. And the US, like it or not, has a system where we say if you can arrive on our shores, you can claim asylum, and that's the system that we have. So if we're going to change that, that's another conversation. But if we're going to continue to have that as really the one of the founding principles of our immigration system, then we're going to have to find a better way to address that. And things like requiring people to submit asylum applications before they get to the border is encouraging them to do that through a legal channel rather than an illegal one.
Well, Laurie, you've been very patient with my rather obnoxious questions. Let's get to the book. As I said, it's in many ways connected with Euro Without Borders, a history, but it focuses not on a place, but on a year, the period just before 2019, when the world, at least borrowing from the title of your book, closed its doors, the COVID-19 tragedy and the future of borders. So what happened? COVID began in the late winter of 2020. What was happening in 2019?
So, I mean, in 2019, you had COVID popping up in China mainly. I think many people, myself included, saw it as something that was happening far away, and was starting to become a little bit more concerning. And then most countries waited pretty long before they really reacted. We had multilateral agreements through the World Health Organization that countries committed to not closing their borders because that was not considered an effective reaction to fighting a pandemic. And then one by one, sort of the dominoes started to fall. And the United States, of course, closed off travel from China and then from Europe and then from Canada and Mexico, and the list went on. So in about spring of 2020, I believe 90% of the world's population was living in a country that had some form of border restriction because of the pandemic.
The subtitle of the book is The COVID-19 Tragedy and the Future of Borders. COVID-19 was, of course, a tragedy. Millions of people died. But in your view, is the tragedy or part of the tragedy that the world closed its doors? Was it a mistake?
We argue that yes, it was a mistake to rely on borders as for many countries as their primary policy response to COVID. We argue that borders have sort of become the big red button that governments will push during a crisis. We saw it really take root during COVID, and I think we're going to see it more and more, particularly in the coming years, where governments are trying to solve a problem by using borders that is not adequately addressed just by using borders.
But wasn't it the natural, the instinctive response of governments throughout the world to shut the border, especially in the early days when no one even quite knew what COVID-19 was?
Yeah.
Certainly before there was any kind of antidote to it. Wasn't the natural response to say, we're shutting the borders until we know more?
Absolutely. It was a knee-jerk response. I think it, could be justified in the early months, but the problem was in many places, those restrictions lasted for 1, 2, sometimes 3 years. So the United States had COVID border restrictions till about June of 2023. So they lasted a really long time. And essentially, we argue in the book that in some ways, those restrictions enabled governments to be a little bit lazy about how they were going to address real fundamental domestic public health challenges that they perhaps didn't have adequate tools for. So shutting their borders was sort of a blunt and somewhat theatrical way of saying we're protecting people from a virus that's out there, even though the virus was already circulating and already passing through community spread by the time those border restrictions were put in place.
The US gets criticized, of course, all the time from every political angle. My understanding is that some countries were even more paranoid and even more aggressive on their borders. Japan, for example, perhaps China. Where does America appear on the league table when it comes to closing their borders during COVID?
I mean, America was pretty sloppy about it, I think. You had countries like you said, mentioned China, Australia, and New Zealand as well, who were very strict, and then other countries like Mexico, who sort of had border restrictions on the book but did not actually enforce them at all. And then the United States had these different agreements, this patchwork where we had no-fly lists based on infection rates, and then we had this very funky agreement with Canada and Mexico that said, okay, we're going to restrict our land borders to all non-essential travel, which was never actually defined, but you can fly to the United States for any reason whatsoever. So if you were a grandmother living up in Canada and you wanted to drive 20 minutes across the border to see your grandchild, you could not do that, but you could fly to the US and go to Disney World.
So what does that suggest? That it
So
hadn't been thought through, that it was being driven by large corporations like Disney, or that it was all a heartless enterprise to separate grandmothers from their grandchildren.
I think it was a combination of, again, sort of this border theater. The Trump administration, in particular, was more than happy to shut the southern border with Mexico and stop processing asylum claims. I mean, this was part of a broader strategy of getting back to the things we were talking about earlier. And it was not that difficult to do, right? You could have officers at the border saying, no, you can't cross. I mean, there's physical infrastructure already in place. Now, when it came to air travel, this is a question that I have tried to get from the Department of Homeland Security, and the response has always been that air travel was treated the same, regardless of what country people were flying from. So if Canada had a very high infection rate, then air travel might have been um, reduced from Canada or prevented from Canada. But that air travel component was not part of the direct agreement with Canada or with Mexico.
It's interesting when I'm thinking out loud, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but within the US, there seem to be two broad political responses to COVID. There was the Californian response, which was pretty aggressive, and the response in Florida from DeSantis that was, if not more tolerant or liberal, certainly more open, allowing people to work, making the wearing of masks illegal. Would you politicize the way in which the world closed its doors? You noted Australia and New Zealand in particular, which tend to be very liberal, and the United States, particularly under Trump, which isn't. Is there a connection between the politics of the government and its response to COVID, or is it more cultural, perhaps in a place like Japan, which has historically always been rather paranoid about its own cultural insularity?
Yeah, I think it's both because Europe is a good example of countries that had, a array of political leanings and all reacted in a very nationalistic way in the early days. Their restrictions did not last nearly as long as the United States did. So there was certainly political issues there. I think Canada is another interesting example where you have a country who culturally has been very aware of the different health systems in Canada, very proud of the Canadian access to healthcare, very appalled at the US situation. So that was really a cultural reaction, I think, to protecting their borders and what they saw as Americans potentially flooding their healthcare system, which I don't think would have happened. But also very political because you had very toxic relations between Trudeau and Trump at the time. You had the US having put tariffs on Canadian products through national security auspices, which was very insulting to the Canadians. And this was kind of a bit of an opportunity for the Canadians to say, you know what, Americans, we may depend on you for trade, but trade kept moving. So we have to remember that. But we're going to shut that border as much as we can because we're pretty pissed off at you. I do think that was a component of it because Canadian public opinion was very supportive of the border restrictions.
Well, next time there's a major global epidemic, won't be a problem because, at least according to Trump, Canada will be part of the United States. Are there models, in all seriousness, Laurie, any examples of countries that, in your view, did it right or did it better than the United States or Japan?
Yeah, we looked at, countries all over the world. South Korea was one of the standout exceptions that never technically closed their borders, didn't sort of say based on your citizenship or based on your reason of travel, you can't come. They allowed people to travel there, but they had a very stringent contact tracing and quarantine program in place. So they had the capacity and they had the ability to ensure that people could continue to travel to South Korea while also protecting public health. Now, in the United States, we would never be able, I don't think, to accomplish that kind of quarantine and contact tracing system. But a country like South Korea did very well with their infection rates while not closing their borders.
Particularly interesting given that one of their borders is with China. What about the Chinese record? Did they shut their borders aggressively, especially given that the epidemic seems to have begun there?
Yeah, I mean, from, I'm sure you'll remember all of the stories of the severity of the domestic lockdowns as well. So, China was one of those few countries that really nearly achieved that zero COVID goal through internal and external border control, but at an incredibly high cost. The Chinese economy suffered, the Chinese people suffered, and as we saw towards the end of the pandemic, there was actual protest in China for the first time of that scale since the Tiananmen Square. So people were very much unwilling to continue to operate under those conditions, and then the variants continued to circulate regardless.
It must have been a particularly odd time for you. I mean, COVID was surreal for all of us. The world suddenly shut down, but for you as a student of borders and of crossings, it must have seemed very weird. What was it like for you in COVID? Were you locked down in Washington?
It wasn't too bad where I live. Our governor, I mean, I should I should walk back a bit because my daughter was out of school and I couldn't come to work, but our governor didn't close down public spaces that were outdoors. So we always sort of had a little bit of an outlet. But professionally, it was shocking. I've told this story several times, but about a week before the Canada-US border was closed, I spoke with a colleague at the Canadian consulate in Seattle, and we were sort of joking, looking at what was happening with the European travel bans and saying, "Oh, that will never happen with Canada and the US because we have such a long border, we depend on each other so much, and we have such integrated relationship that we'll find a better way to manage this than we did." And so it was shocking, particularly for some of the communities that rely on that border. We have a very strange example of a community that we speak about in the book called Point Roberts, and Point Roberts is a small town that's a little exclave. You actually drive through Canada to get to Point Roberts. It's tacked on to Canadian land. And so the people in Point Roberts were completely isolated. And we worked very hard to try to find exemptions for those people who actually never had a single case of COVID for the first year, 2020. But they were pretty much stuck. They were able to get back and forth to the US on very specific situations. But I heard from many, many people who, were just distraught and trying to find information about when might these be lifted? What does it mean if I'm, to be essential or non-essential? Because the government was not communicating those things to people either. So there was a lot of confusion and a lot of anxiety because of these measures that was just added on to the anxiety and the confusion that we were all already feeling in the early days of the pandemic. And I was really surprised that these restrictions lasted as long as they did and were so misaligned, again, between two countries, Canada and the US, that are deep allies, deep trading relations, and a lot of shared families too on both sides. We didn't really cooperate on them very much.
One of the bête noirs of the MAGA people is Anthony Fauci and what these people at least see as the bureaucracy of COVID. I don't want to personalize it and focus just on Fauci, but is there a degree of responsibility for the professional medical bureaucracy that determined policy within the United States for this failed response, at least in your mind?
Well, regarding the border aspect, which is the one that I should probably stick to because I shouldn't speak too much to some of the domestic measures because I haven't looked into the sausage making behind them. But the border measures were really undertaken in the White House itself. They were not decided by sort of the professionals in the room. They were decided by the people who happened to be, in the White House.
And who were they? I mean, it wasn't Trump himself, was it?
Well, I mean, it was people like, all of the people he had surrounding him, Jared Kushner as well. People that I will never have
A
access
real
to.
medical expert, right?
Yeah.
And the people like Stephen Miller, who is particularly
Oh,
paranoid
yeah.
about immigration, did he get his hands on this?
I'm sure he did. And I'm sure we'll see. I mean, like, Title 42 is a very interesting situation where, I don't know how many of your listeners will be familiar with it, but it was the pandemic era health policy that said that the United States was not going to process asylum claims due to concerns about congregate settings. So concerns about spreading of the virus. That was the last pandemic era border restriction to be removed. It was in place for, again, 3 years, basically. And Trump has already talked about bringing it back as a way to deter migrants and to stop processing asylum claims at the southern border. So these are things that were utilized during COVID. We could argue whether or not they were successful. I think it depends on how we define success in this situation. But I think they're tools that we will see again, which is why we wanted to write the book, because we think there's important lessons to carry forward, particularly now as we have a return of the Trump administration.
Yeah, I want to end this conversation with something about the future of borders, Laurie. But before we get there, I began traveling as soon after I was allowed to. And I always felt that a lot of the responsibility was dumped on the airlines, which was often unfair. How did the private sector deal with a lot of the bureaucratic demands of travel in the COVID period?
Yeah, I mean, in many situations, the private sector was, the gateway for whether or not you had your test or your vaccine. And I think that it was struggling so much as an industry. I mean, we saw the aftermath immediately as people started traveling again. Um, that I can't speak for the airline industry, but I can say that a lot of the businesses that depended on cross-border travel, particularly people shopping back and forth, were pushing and started to push as these restrictions dragged on. And it may have been their pushing that moved the needle, particularly for the Canadian government. Perhaps less so for the US government, but their voices were there. But again, we had trade continuing to move. So COVID was sort of this interesting experiment where many governments around the world took the same approach in limiting the mobility of people to control the spread of the virus while continuing to allow the movement of goods. And China was a bit of an exception, and there's some other exceptions. But the result of that was most people didn't really feel those impacts unless you were somebody living a cross-border life, somebody depending on cross-border travel for your business. You were still getting your toilet paper and your Peloton bikes and all of these things you depended on. So governments discovered, this is what we argue in the book, that this is a lever that they can use without too much pushback from the public, including the private sector.
Yeah, and I know you address this in the book. One of the interesting contrasts is the success and investment and aggression in terms of finding an antidote, a cure to COVID, the Warp Speed initiative, and the way in which governments dealt with the border. So finally, Laurie, the future of borders. You weren't impressed with the COVID-19 tragedy, both particularly in terms of its impact on borders when the world closed its doors. What should governments learn from the COVID-19 catastrophe?
In regards to borders, governments should learn that there are costs to these measures. The measures themselves are not not the most valuable tools that could be used, particularly if they're over relied upon. They can actually undermine things like public health or security or whatever issue is at hand by detracting from the actual root of the problem. And that really our goal in the book is to say that people should hold their governments accountable in these situations, particularly if borders are sort of used during times of crisis with emergency powers. So even in Europe, where you have Schengen, I mean, you've had your previous guest on, you have a commitment to free mobility. We are seeing more and more border controls and border
Yeah,
closure.
and as we discussed on the when Isaac Stanley Becker came on the show, Germany, even within Schengen now, is
Mhm.
beginning to open its border controls.
So if we're going to live in a world where we're encouraging people to live cross-border lives. We are recruiting students to come to our universities. We're recruiting workers through legal channels to come work in our businesses. There should be some type of assurances for those people who are playing by the rules. I should say our book is really not about undocumented immigrants at all. It's about people that travel through legal pathways. And there should be some protections for them so that they don't find themselves stranded or separated from their loved ones. And there's better ways to do things than to cut people off in this way.
And finally, Laurie, what about the role of international organizations? We did another rather depressing show a week or two ago about the Arab-Israeli, the Arab-Palestinian crisis, in which the UN is failing to really make itself known. Should international organizations, which are by definition cross-border, should they play more of a role here? What did the UN do during the COVID-19 tragedy?
I mean, the World Health Organization was really should have been the pillar. And, I don't have a good answer to your question because I'd like to say, sure, we should work together more. We should cooperate more. We should strengthen our multilateral initiatives and relationships. But as much as we can strengthen them and have them in writing, we tend to throw them out the door when, things hit the fan. So I'm not sure that that is going to have a whole lot of weight, especially in a crisis. I sort of fear, and a realist, but I'm not necessarily always an optimist. I do think that it's a natural tendency of people, and particularly of political leaders, to retreat into nationalistic bubbles. And we saw it during COVID. We're seeing it again now. So I don't know that multilateralism is going to be very effective moving forward. Again, I think if people, particularly those people that have the mobility, they have the passports, they have, they're part of our businesses and our communities, perhaps that is the most productive way to ensure that we approach these issues in a more valuable and productive way than just hitting the red button and reacting by shutting our borders.
And of course, the future could be particularly dark. We've got war in Ukraine, endless war in much of the Middle East, possible war in over Taiwan, American talk, at least, of revanchism, and Canada, Greenland, and the Panama Canal. There is a dystopian future as well, isn't there?
There is. I mean, you're referencing countries that are plagued by violence and war right now, and they're hardening their borders. And at the same time, we're hardening borders with our friends and our allies, and that's troublesome.
Well, Laurie, I wish it was more cheerful, but I wish you a very happy and healthy 2025. I'm not suggesting you migrate, but for all, I appreciate the work you've done, and your book's an important one to warn people of a situation when indeed the world closed its doors. So congratulations on the new book. And as I said, we'll have to get back on the show during the Trump administration, when no doubt there'll be all sorts of scandals and stories on his policies on the border. Thank you so much.
Thanks. It's going to be an interesting year.